almost everybody who has a drug addiction problem also has an alcohol problem. They co-occur very, very tightly. Because if you're going to abuse cocaine, well, you might as well cut it with alcohol. And if you're going to abuse cocaine, you might as well abuse alcohol. And not that sort of thing happens. Now, alcohol is notorious. It's a notorious drug. So it's the only drug we know of that reliably actually directly increases aggression. It's implicated in 50%. Half the people who murder are drunk and half the people who are killed are drunk, right? Without alcohol, there would be almost no domestic violence, right? Alcohol is very bad. It's very, 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 very serious contributor to crime. And then the problem with the other forms of addiction, of course, is that as you become addicted and fall out of society, and you still need to pay for your drugs, there's the temptation to turn to crime to generate the proceeds necessary for you to get your next hit is going to loom large. And, that's catastrophic too, because even from the economic perspective, because it's very hard for people to steal anything now that has any value, right? I mean, you steal a TV from someone's house and you pawn it off. There's no value in it at all. And so the cost of crime is much, much greater than the benefit to the criminal. And that's getting worse and worse. And so, so there's a massive association between addiction and mental health problems, broadly speaking, and criminality. And like active criminality, but also the kind of passive criminality that I think constitutes tent cities, for example. That's the breakdown of social norms, the occupation of public lands, the general decrease in the civility of common life that's associated with widespread despair and catastrophe on the streets, especially in a place like Alberta that's so bloody bitterly cold. So, how in the world do you live out in the streets through an Alberta winter? You can hardly live inside a house in an Alberta winter. So you went to the corrections facility, and we want to get back to the oxycodone story.
Sure, and so I'll just make this point broadly, because you went down asking about the Alberta model and what it is. It fundamentally is an assumption that we need to address the addiction crisis seriously. To understand why it's been such a problem, we have to look at how oxycodone crisis turned into a second crisis within Canada that was propagated and aggravated by the federal government with their policies. We are fundamentally saying that addiction is a part of the crisis that individuals face. And if you try and do housing first, as Minister Nixon made the point, without addressing addiction, right, you're going to end up in a very, very difficult spot, right? You need to say, the nature of an addiction, if we're talking about an opioid addiction, many people who are addicted to opioids lose a fifth to a quarter of their body weight because they don't have a desire to eat or drink, because the dopamine hit you get is 200% increase from your baseline level when you do an opioid. Imagine if this conversation was the best conversation we'd ever had, the most stimulating ever. That would be 25% increase in our dopamine, maybe, off our baseline, from what I understand. You're talking about something 8 times as compelling. Of course, no one's going to want to have a conversation or eat a burger or drink water or have sex or, continue to hold down a paying job and be a part of society.
America's healthcare system is lacking in any real care. Insurance companies regularly deny progressive treatment options, primary care physicians refuse to order comprehensive lab work, and the standards of care lag years behind the leading research. That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick Health represents a paradigm shift in how we approach medicine. The premier health optimization platform, Merrick Health empowers you to maximize your longevity and performance with the confidence that comes from having experts in your back pocket. They offer cutting-edge diagnostic labs, concierge health coaching, and expert clinical oversight. They help you achieve your health and fitness goals by leveraging data-driven lifestyle and nutrition recommendations, along with supplement and prescription treatment options. If you're listening to this show, then you're probably a proponent of taking your health into your own hands. That's why we've teamed up with Merrick Health to offer a turnkey optimization package designed for those who want to maximize their performance and longevity with the most elaborate testing on the market. You'll receive extensive lab work, thorough lab reports, video calls with Merrick's health experts, and expedited onboarding. Go to merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson to get the same panel and medical oversight I get and save 10% at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson at checkout.
The rat literature indicated pretty convincingly that it was actually pretty hard to addict rats that were in their wild habitat to cocaine. But if you isolated them in a cage, you could get them addicted to cocaine to the point where they would only self-administer cocaine and they wouldn't do anything else, barely drink. certainly not eat, certainly not be interested in sex. And so if you're dealing with people who are alienated, who aren't integrated into a community that allows them alternative forms of genuine reward, then the dopaminergic chemicals become that much more attractive.
And if you want to look at examples of that, just look at Western society that atomizes everyone increasingly. And there are all sorts of benefits to the personal autonomy that we have in society, but increasingly we're more isolated than we've ever been. And COVID was, pardon the expression, that on steroids. It was so much more so, this isolation that happened. And an addiction is fundamentally a disease of isolation. And the antidote to that is recovery, which is a community relationship again. In some way.
Community and purpose.
That's right.
Those.
So let's get to that question around.
Well, draw the line between the oxycodone overprescription and the government policies that facilitated the development of the opioid crisis. Now, is that associated with the policies that, say, characterize Vancouver, where drugs are distributed widely and easily, and the
that
most
is the understatement of the decade to say widely and easily. So the oxycodone crisis created a North American opioid pandemic. The authority on this is a Stanford Lancet Commission written by Dr. Keith Humphreys, who is a professor seen to be a universally accepted expert when it comes to the opioid crisis in North America. It's distinctly North American as a crisis. There are aspects of this that we see in other parts of the world, but we see the opioid crisis created a market for opioid users that wasn't just that Toronto, Vancouver, LA, New York for that heroin market that would have existed. Instead, everyone that had a prescription, i.e. everyone with a pharmacy, a dispensary, and a family physician, and anyone who had pain in their life, there now was a market for that. And we saw a massive explosion. And so one of the axiomatic truths of addiction broadly, and it is on full display with the late 90s and early 2000s, is if you increase supply to a market and you don't have barriers there, then you're going to increase harm. Addiction will come out of that. And it's just axiomatic. You can't get around it. So if you massively dump high-powered opioids, twice as powerful as heroin, into every single community, and you start with a trusted institution prescribing these, your family physician, passing them out en masse with huge amounts of diversion, which means to say the person who was prescribed the opioid doesn't receive the opioid. Instead, it gets traded or marketed to some other individual. You're creating a new addict. And the way that the addiction works, especially with opioids, is it continues to ratchet up and it escalates. And so you might become tolerant after a while of receiving heroin or twice as powerful oxycodone, so you take twice as many of those pills. And after a time, you saw a massive resurgence of the heroin market across all of North America.
And is that what opened the door to fentanyl?
And so fentanyl is just a much, much more powerful version of heroin. So if you look at oxycodone, which is twice as powerful as heroin, thereabouts, fentanyl is about 100 to 200 times more powerful than that. And so as tolerance continues to escalate in a using population, there are very clever chemists, in the illicit chemists, that are going to find a new high-powered opioid that will be able to satiate that desire. And so if you are using over a long period of time, months and years, you no longer can get a high off of that lower powered opioid. So you need to be seeking more and more. And fentanyl is one of them, but there's sufentanil and carfentanil and some clever chemist that's going to create something even more damaging afterwards. It's not just that the opioid gives you that dopamine hit and that high that we talked about. If that was all it was, there would be all sorts of difficulties in managing that because of its addictive properties. But the opioid also can access different receptors in the brain, as you well know. And one of those receptors are what depress your respiration. And so if you get a really powerful opioid, like say fentanyl, that's hundreds of times more powerful than heroin, then your breathing will stop to the point where you don't pump blood through your chest anymore and your veins don't deliver that oxygen. And to your brain, you will have cerebral hypoxia, which is akin to drowning in daylight. You're suffocating for air in your brain. And that's what an opioid overdose is. And so
that's running rampant on the West Coast.
And fentanyl is particularly bad at this, right? And so we had a few factors come together. The failure of the institutions that were meant to protect us, the academic institutions that train physicians, the colleges that regulate physicians, the regulatory bodies that regulate the access to drugs themselves, and it went unchecked for over a decade and created a mass market. And this is like a slow-moving freight train towards our healthcare system and towards your family and your community members that end up hooked on an addiction to an opioid. And we know that that addiction will escalate. And that addiction, run its course, has only one of two ends. And if someone says otherwise, they're lying to you and maybe even to themselves. The addiction, run its course, either ends in pain, misery, and given enough time, death through an overdose or some other ancillary consequence like not eating or lacerations from living in intensity, you name it. Carnage that happens, trauma lives in addiction. The alternative to that, and it's the only alternative, given enough time, is treatment, recovery from your addiction, and that second lease on life, to be a community member again, to be a brother or a mother.
One of the reliable findings in the alcohol addiction treatment literature, virtually no treatments for alcoholism work. But that doesn't mean that people don't recover. And one of the primary pathways to recovery, and this has been known, I would say, for 7 or 8 decades, is something approximating religious transformation. This has been well known among researchers who have no stake in the matter from a religious perspective. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the drugs of abuse, like alcohol, if you're prone to it, have this dopaminergic kick that you're describing. So dopamine kicks in when you see yourself moving towards a valued goal. And so that feels good, but it also reinforces the development of the neural systems that underlie that movement. So if you do something and it works, it makes you feel good, but the systems that you use to do that grow, and dopamine does both of those.